Hello everyone and welcome back yet again to another week here on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. I am your host as always, Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in yet again. And to kick off the week, we should have a great show ahead, a great slate of segments for you today. Starting off, talking some Monday Night Football. An interesting game between the Giants and the Steelers will take place tonight, and I've got you all covered from a betting perspective there. Then, as always, we look to our NFL and college football fantasy stars of the weekend, the guys who impressed me the most over this past week. I begin my positional rankings with my QB picks for Week 9 of the NFL season and conclude today's show with my favorite segments, my ever-popular segment, my bold fantasy predictions, or my don't be surprised if you will, segment. But before we get into any of that good stuff, I do want to remind you, as always, that if you want to see more content such as this across many different shows, across many different networks here at GSMC, consider liking, following, and subscribing to the show and the network as a whole. But if you want to interact with shows such as my show or others around the network as well more directly, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Things, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. You can do one of two things to interact with us here on YouTube. You can press that $ in your comment section, leave a tip or donation, or just leave any burning questions, comments, or concerns you may have surrounding my show. You can do it for other podcasts as well, and it's greatly appreciated because we know that it makes our shows that much more better. But without further ado, let us jump into our first segment of the day, and let us talk some Monday Night Football. Sorry guys, I may have some mixed up little graphic subtitles here. We'll make do as we can, but let's talk about this Monday Night Football game first and foremost, because it's one of those games that's not as appealing as you would like, but it certainly is one that warrants, consideration, especially from a betting perspective. So there we go. We might have to fix these little subtitles here as we go along, but that is my mistake, and we will have to just go head on. But looking at this game, especially from a betting perspective, I feel like it was made more clear what with, the Steelers really honing in on starting Russell Wilson. I feel like if Justin Fields were the starter for this game, there may have been more question marks surrounding, how this game would play out for Pittsburgh, but now I feel more confident that Pittsburgh will be the winners of this game. The Giants right now, on the other hand, are an offense who really aren't looking that much appealing to NFL audiences. They're not an offense that can generate enough to keep up with certain teams, and while the Pittsburgh Steelers are certainly a team that I feel like still have some major flaws, and the fact that Russell Wilson, as good as he was last week against New York, there still are some cracks to be papered over. I still think, that if you're the Giants, you really aren't necessarily going to be in many more games such as this, or have opportunities against many more teams if this is what your offense looked like. You kind of started the season a little bit sneakily, getting decent wins against Seattle, and, getting Malik Neighbors going early, which was paramount to your success. But now, if you're a Giants fan, or if you're the Giants in general, you've kind of dropped off the face of a cliff, really, in terms of offensive production. However, I feel like this game is going to be won or lost by both teams, for that matter. On the defensive side of the football, I feel like the Steelers' defense is one that right now should still be an elite, almost top 5 to 10 unit, but it feels more middling in almost every statistical metric than in past years. I feel like this Steelers defense can definitely be one of those defenses that can be solved rather than, them really leaving their marks on certain games. But this Giants offense is going to be very challenged, especially, if their deep ball prowess or any sort of short to intermediate area throw gets taken away from them. So I feel like a large part of the Giants' success, at least in the offensive end of things, will have to stem from the run game. And not for nothing, I do like certain elements of the Giants' run game. I like the fact that, they feel they have some depth in that area of their offense, but it's about utilizing that depth in a way that is able to sustain offensive drives, and most importantly, retain the ball for as long as possible. Because I feel now with the Steelers, you kind of feel like Russell Wilson is capable of running an efficient offense that really takes away your ability to gain momentum throughout the game. Because even though Russell Wilson, the big part of why a lot of people thought he would be the better starter for the Steelers when all was said and done was because of his deep ball prowess, he still is someone who can be efficient, whether it be in the play action or in the run game, and keep his offense on schedule. So that should be the worry and concern for the Giants offensively as well as defensively, because offensively, you don't necessarily want to be playing keep up. You want to retain the football for as long as possible, keep the Pittsburgh offense off the field, and most importantly, find a way to solve that Pittsburgh defense. And you can if you utilize your running backs properly, because Singletary is someone who has had his peaks and valleys this season. He's had a couple fumbles early in the season. He hasn't really been that effective in the red zone. But if you can get him going, then that can alleviate some of the burden on Daniel Jones' shoulders and the shoulders of the passing game. So look for the Giants running backs to really try and make their mark in this game. As for the Steelers, I think their game plan is just going to see if Russ can employ some of the same things we saw in the New York game and have it carry over. Because he proved that he can be a starting quarterback in the system. Now we just have to see it on a more consistent basis, because make no ands, ifs, or buts about it, the Steelers look like they could be a playoff team right now. The reason I'm only saying could is because of the fact they can't get caught up in, beating inferior opponents and then feel as if, they can beat the Ravens and the Chiefs of the world come playoff time. No, they have to understand that there are still flaws to this team. For example, the wide receiver core is still thin. Like I said, there are ways to score against this defense. So you have to, A, make sure that you feel like Russ is going to be the answer of the quarterback position for the season, but B, most importantly, adjust to things now rather than later. Because if you see little deficiencies in your game plan in this game, it's easier to fix in this game where you feel like you should win than in a game where you feel like the cards are stacked against you. Because then that takes away some of the excitement of your start to the season if you're the Steelers. And I feel like for tonight's game, this is going to be the game where the Steelers kind of iron out all the kinks. They look good in some aspects, look bad in others, and ultimately they come away from this game with a win, which I think they will. Most importantly, more answers about how they can fix this whole operation to get it looking like a well-oiled machine. Because, not for nothing, that small sample size we saw in that New York Jets game was very impressive for this Russell Wilson-led offense. There are still some things that could do with some tailoring. And so, going forward, it's up to, the coaching staff and, Russell Wilson to understand the comfortability of where they are as a team right now. And they're a solid football team. Don't get me wrong. That there are ways they can fall back a little bit in the AFC playoff picture if, things start to go awry. For the Giants, this game, I feel like, is necessarily a must-win game because I kind of feel like they're playing themselves out of the NFC race, even though the NFC race is so crowded. I feel like, there are some aspects of the Giants that could get them wins against opponents such as the Steelers, but tonight, I just don't feel it's their night. I feel like, that game against Philly was very, very much a wake-up call where they understood the ineptitude of their offense. If anything, though, the defense can keep this thing close. I love the defensive front. I love the versatility of guys like Lawrence and Thibodeau. And I love how they contribute to this offense. The defense. That being said, you're going to have to really dominate the time of possession if you want to have any chance of beating the Steelers team. Because, like I said, this is still a team that predicates itself a little bit on the abilities of Russell Wilson in the passing game. And so there could be some dangers there for the Pittsburgh Steelers. But I feel like the best path forward for the Giants to prevent anything going completely off the rails and to make this game as close as possible is to run the football. Because there are some moments where, it looks like Daniel Jones can be effective. But there are some where he gets kind of caught up in the moment like we saw against Philly. So it's going to be about whether or not we get a semi-decent Daniel Jones. It's going to be whether or not the Giants can run the football effectively. It's going to be whether or not, the Steelers' offense still has some kinks to be ironed out. And as a result, it shows up on the football field. But other than that, I feel like the Pittsburgh Steelers are the far superior team in this one, and that is why I am picking them to win this game. I think maybe, the Giants can cover this spread because a 6.5 point spread is pretty high for the Steelers team that's still trying to figure itself out. But look for this to be a very scrappy football game early, and maybe we see a little bit more of what Pittsburgh can be down the stretch in this one. But let me know what you think in the comments, because this is a truly bizarre Monday Night Football game that I'm not sure a lot of people outside of the few Giants and Steelers fans I know will be really excited about. But let me know what you think about this in the comments. But coming up on the other side, we begin looking at our fantasy stars of the week, starting off in the NFL. Hopefully, your guys' favorite players will be on this list. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back to talk about it.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits, some losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip, you choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Now, before we get into our second segment of the day, I do want to remind you yet again that if you do feel so inclined throughout the show, make yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. As always, it's a great way to contribute to the show. And as always, get your opinions and comments throughout the show out there as well. But let's get into our second segment. As we see here, going to be talking about the NFL Fantasy Stars of the Week. Sorry, I had to type that in. Sorry in advance if any of these graphic subtitles or headers do get mixed up throughout the show. Bear with me here. We know what we'll be talking about as soon as I get into the topics, I guess. But let's get into our NFL Fantasy Stars of Week 8. And the 4 players I selected, these are guys who may not have expected to make this list, or me personally, I did not expect them to make this list, but they still put on performances, win or lose, that highly warranted my inclusion of them on this list. And not for nothing, I tend to favor players from winning teams, but this week there are some performances that I couldn't ignore. And even though 3 of these guys won, the first guy that I want to talk about on this list showed a lot of moxie in a loss. And yes, it was a very detrimental loss for his team, but considering the circumstances of what he was facing and the absences of some key players on his offense, I had to include him on this list. And it begins not with Josh Jacobs. Sorry. These graphics here get a little mixed up. I don't know why. There might be some confusion there, but bear with me. I have to talk about Baker Mayfield at the quarterback position, being one of my fantasy stars of the week. And yes, I know he did lose, and I don't necessarily like picking teams that lost, but there's something to be said about Baker Mayfield's performance in the face of such adversity for this Tampa Bay team. Bereft of their top 2 receivers for who knows how long. Maybe they get Mike Evans back after the bye, but they're not getting Chris Godwin back for the rest of the season. And facing this Falcons team who had all the energy potentially hearing about this news and had more motivation seeing as to how if they did win this game, which they did, they would be 2 games above the Bucs in the NFC South race and own the tiebreaker. So, in that situation, a lot of people would be hard-pressed to have thought that Baker Mayfield put up the stat line that he did. And yet, he's showing his moxie and showing his newfound swagger in Tampa Bay with 34-43 completions, 330 yards, 3 touchdowns. He did have 2 interceptions, though, but a total of 22.3 fantasy points this week. And he's really showing that this Tampa Bay team can rely upon him no matter the situation. Yes, it's going to be an uphill climb to get back into this NFC South race. And yes, you already had the odds stacked against you because the Atlanta Falcons beat you twice. But if he's shown anything, is that in this tough stretch, he's going to prove to a lot of people that this is a different Baker Mayfield than what we saw perhaps at the tail end of his Browns career, or even at the start of his Browns career as well, where he had his peaks and valleys. This has been a truly consistent, or as consistent as they can be, Baker Mayfield season. And I feel like in order for this Tampa Bay Buccaneers team to truly impress me even more, why not go out against the Chiefs and give them a game as well? And with this Baker Mayfield performance, chances are they could indeed give the Chiefs a tough outing. But moving on to our running backs, getting a little mixed up with the graphics here, so do bear with me. Let us talk about Josh Jacobs. I'm sorry, this will foreshadow who I am going to be talking about at the wide receiver position. Some of my pictures must have gotten messed up in the graphics, but do bear with me here. Josh Jacobs of the Green Bay Packers. 25 carries, 127 yards, 2 touchdowns, 25.5 fantasy points to avoid this whole trap game aesthetic against the Jacksonville Jaguars. And I kind of felt like this was kind of going to be one of those games where Josh Jacobs had to step up, because even though there were some good things in the past game for the Packers, in this one, you kind of feel like at certain points throughout the season, Josh Jacobs is going to be called upon to step up early and often for this offense. That's what he did. I feel like Josh Jacobs kind of gets lost in the morass of the Green Bay Packers offense, and he's not as well renowned as some of their receivers, as Jordan Love, but he is still an effective fantasy running back, and people can't forget that. And this game proved that in certain situations, things can go awry for the Packers against inferior teams, and you're going to have to find different ways to win. And this week, they lean on Josh Jacobs, and he delivered for them. And that's all the Green Bay really needs right now. A consistent presence that allows for them to relax. And so, look for Josh Jacobs to be week by week someone who has his ups and downs, but overall is really effective in getting his team to reach the highest heights. And so, if the Packers do struggle in some games such as this, where they're going up against, like I said, more inferior opponents. Their schedule is one of the lighter ones, I believe, in the league. Look for Josh Jacobs to step up, because we always talk about these receivers. We always talk about Jordan Love's effectiveness in this offense. But don't forget why they brought in Josh Jacobs in the first place. To establish the run game, get a physical guy, and a guy who can be in attack mode against inferior competition and really wear them down. So kudos to Josh Jacobs for stepping up in what could have been a potential trap game situation. The third guy, I'm sorry, this is a picture of Cam Ward. Kind of stuck between two worlds here of football, but let's talk about Cedric Tillman. Let's talk about this guy who's suddenly seeing his game elevate with the Cleveland Browns, and suddenly seeing the optimism surrounding the Cleveland Browns offense as a whole begin to rise. And I feel like his newfound connection with Jameis Winston is something reminiscent of what Joe Flacco had with David Njoku last year, where I feel like these veteran QBs who had to fill in the gaps of the Deshaun Watson era here in Cleveland have really struck a rapport with certain guys and really elevated them. And for as long as Jameis Winston's going to play, Cedric Tillman can be that guy. 7 receptions, 99 yards, 2 touchdowns, including the game winner, for a total of 28.9 fantasy points. And not for nothing, this Browns offense, remember, is sans Amari Cooper. They traded him away thinking that, there was really going to be no such hope for the pass game in this offense, potentially giving up the ghost a little bit before, even before Deshaun Watson was injured. But now, with Jameis Winston looking very competent in this offense and proving that perhaps Deshaun Watson was the problem all along, Cedric Tillman has room to grow, because he's one of the younger guys in this receiving core, and who knows what the Browns will look like with all the dead money they might eat next year if they should cut Deshaun Watson. But Cedric Tillman looks like a guy who you can build around on this offense. He looks like a guy who you can invest in by building your skill position core around him because of his verticality, because of his speed, because of his rapport with certain guys in this offense. And I really like this performance as one of the unsung performances of the weekend and one of the biggest upsets of the weekend at that. So Cedric Tillman, we're going to talk about him a little bit throughout the week because he's also someone who could be a hidden gem out for you on the waiver wire. But I do really like what I've seen from him in this offense. And then, last but not least, let's talk about the tight end position. It was National Tight End Day yesterday, so, of course, you had to think all of these tight ends would have to show up and show out. And I could have picked any tight end, really, to truly show the strength of this position, respect them after their day is done. But the guy who I picked didn't necessarily have the touchdowns, didn't necessarily have, the sexiest of wins, didn't necessarily, truly ingratiate himself in the offense. But what I'm seeing out of him is growth that his particular team needs from him in this situation. Because this team has proven that in this very crowded NFC West, they can stick around. Because all the teams are at 500, including them, and they perhaps have, when they're on, one of the better offenses in the division. Let's talk about the Arizona Cardinals and what Trey McBride means to this team. Like I said, didn't have touchdowns like Kyle Pitts and my guy Cade Otton had. But he still had a very efficient game. 9 receptions, 129 yards, 21.4 fantasy points. And basically that's all you can ask of a tight end, even without the touchdown production you may want. When I look at the state of the tight end position, it's really become much more up in the air than people think. Because while you have consistent performers at the position, you don't necessarily have as much middle ground as you expected. I feel like the middle ground has kind of fallen out, whether it be because of injuries, whether it be because of underperformance or overperformance from certain players. I kind of feel like the middle ground has become very messy in terms of this position. But the one player who I was kind of expecting to transcend both of these tiers, I'll say, was Trey McBride. And to start the season, he was kind of proving to be someone who's going to be very frustrating because of his offense and how he fit into it. I feel like at the start, he really wasn't as effective as one might have wanted him to be. But as the season has gone along, we've seen progression from him week in, week out that shows that he is someone who can truly be effective in this setup for Arizona. If he gets going and his physicality rings true for the entire team, at least on the offensive side, because the defense still is a big question mark, then I feel like the Cardinals can truly contend and compete in the NFC West, potentially sneak a surprising win for the NFC West. And Trey McBride is going to have to be the center of it all. I could have picked, like I said, Kyle Pitts, whose 2-touchdown performance perhaps was the difference in the game against the Bucs. I could have picked Cade Otton, whose valiant effort proved that the Bucs might have enough to sustain themselves over this tough stretch before they get Evans back. I could have picked any tight end. Of all the tight ends, this is the most tight end performance I could find, so to speak, out of all of them, because Trey McBride, he was not a guy who I was expecting to score many touchdowns, but still a guy whose physicality, the difference. And in real life and in fantasy, he's proving just that. So he's going to round out my NFL Fantasy Stars of the Week list. Hope you guys enjoyed it as always. I love presenting my list to you every Monday. But coming up after this short break on the other side, we'll be discussing our college football Fantasy Stars of the Week. A lot to discuss here. A lot of breakout performances. A lot of important performances to talk about in this one. So you definitely don't want to miss it. Don't go anywhere. We will be right back after this short break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. We are now on our third segment of the day here, and we're going to take a little respite from the world of the NFL for a little bit and talk about the world of college football as always. We talk about NFL fantasy stars. We can't forget about our college football ones as well. For any fantasy college football players out there watching today, it should be a good one here because we have a lot of interesting performances from this past weekend to discuss, and overall a lot of breakout performances as well. Without further ado, let's talk about them. At the quarterback position, this is a guy who I feel like finally found a formula that works for him in a very important game for this Notre Dame team. Because we always think about Riley Leonard as someone who is an effective runner of the football, but his dual threat abilities really suffer when it comes to the passing game. He's not as effective as a passer as we would want out of a dual threat QB, and we've seen it throughout the season. We've seen him put together very solid rushing performances, but haven't necessarily seen him pass the football as effectively as you would like for someone of his caliber and for someone playing at that kind of program. But against Navy at MetLife, it all came together. 13 of 21, 178 yards, 2 touchdowns to the air. Still had 10 carries for 83 yards and 1 touchdown on the ground for a total of 29.4 fantasy points. But this proved that Riley Leonard's going to be a scary guy should Notre Dame get into the CFP. And they're still very much in the discussion. Remember, as an independent, it might be tougher for them to truly prove to the committee without being in a conference their strengths. And so they needed this win against a ranked Navy side who, for all intents and purposes, was looking like they could have upset Notre Dame with their style of play, but ultimately came up very disgustingly short. Navy could not necessarily get anything going. And so Notre Dame rolls on And if you want to see Riley Leonard succeed, this was the performance that showed that he can succeed in both manners, through the air and through the ground. And it's a very important one because they face another military academy looking to knock them down a peg, an Army. So this performance is truly paramount to the success of Riley Leonard and this Notre Dame team as well. So congratulations to Riley Leonard for making this list for the first time. The running back position, this is a guy who's going to turn a lot of heads in the playoff race, especially in the ACC that's getting just that much more congested as weeks go on. How about Brashard Smith of the SMU Mustangs? 26 carries, 177 yards, 2 touchdowns, 27.4 fantasy points. The week before a big game against Pitt that proves what those schools will be an ACC contender. And not for nothing, I feel like SMU is one of those teams who relies on the explosiveness they have on the offensive side of the football. They're going to win games by beating you, by scoring as many points as possible before you can even blink your eye. And so Brashard Smith being a part of this offensive unit is highly integral to their standings in both the ACC and CFP races, because if one offensive weapon for SMU is off, then who knows how this team will translate in tougher games on the stretch. Because not for nothing, Pitt's looked very efficient and their defense is very scary. So I feel like if SMU does not look prepared for that game, then they're challenging. But for the time being, I feel like SMU is going to be a team ready for anything here in the ACC down the stretch. But it's going to be dependent on guys like Brashard Smith to step up. Because as much as I love Kevin Jennings, there might be a time where his dual threat abilities get exposed, and Pitt could be that team. So you need that balance on your offense if you're SMU. But for the time being, Brashard Smith is definitely deserving of a place on my list. At the wide receiver position, it's a little bit tough to kind of parse through these wide receiver performances. No one really stood out. But I feel like this guy who's making his second appearance on my list actually is one of those guys who you wouldn't have expected starting the year to really have as much of an impact as people think. But as someone who's been all too familiar with him this season and all too familiar to what he brings to the plate for Texas as a Texas Longhorns fan, I really think we're starting to see the growth maturity of this young man in DeAndre Moore. I feel like as one of the younger players in that wide receiver core, he is going to be someone who for many years here at the program would be someone who potentially has so much more room for growth because of the fact no one really expected him to break out this early in his career here. But this game, a very rough game for Texas where they needed every bit of their offensive production. 5 receptions, 97 yards, 2 touchdowns for a total of 24.7 fantasy points for DeAndre Moore. This goes to show that if Texas are in games on the stretch, especially in this very tough stretch after their bye where they're facing Florida, Arkansas, and Kentucky, teams very capable of knocking them down a peg. And then in their final game of the season, going on the road to Kyle Field to face a very, very physical Texas A&M team who's looking to potentially eliminate them from CFP contention. You're going to need versatility in your offense. That's the name of the game for Texas, and that's what their credo is that they live by. So look for DeAndre Moore to potentially, as the season goes on, get more and more looks at the wide receiver position. Most importantly, have that translate over into many more years in the Arch Manning era of success for him and this team. Because I feel like this season for Texas has proved to be a wake-up call a little bit in their first 2 real big SEC tests. At home to Georgia, they got knocked down a peg. On the road to Vanderbilt, who's now becoming a very tough team to play against at home, and not necessarily a pushover anymore here in the SEC. I feel like Texas is starting to realize what it needs to truly compete year in, year out in the SEC. And DeAndre Moore could be an X factor to their success in this conference for many years. And now, just two guys who I wanted to mention, not necessarily because of the fact that I would choose them over any of the other three guys I've picked, because it was very difficult in terms of trying to pick so many different people at so many different positions because of the fact that there were not that many good performances by certain positions. But these are two guys who, on national title contending teams, could prove to be vital and integral to their team's success. One being a running back who people can't oft forget about in this Miami offense, and a Penn State quarterback potentially is going to have to play in the biggest game of the year next week for them, but truly showed what he could look like in that one and showing how serviceable he can be for the Nittany Lions. And witnessing him firsthand on the campus of Penn State really shows me how electrifying this kid can be. So without further ado, let's talk about Damien Martinez and then discuss Beau Pribula. Let's talk about Damien Martinez. First, 15 carries, 148 yards, 2 touchdowns, 29.4 fantasy points to completely take over the state of Florida. Miami has now beaten all the Florida teams this season, and this one wasn't necessarily, about, compiling a lofty number of yards for Cam Ward, as we've seen in the past for him. It was about Damien Martinez. And let's not forget how good Damien Martinez is. An Oregon State transfer comes into Miami looking for a fresh start, really boosting this team as well, because not only do you have to account for the effectiveness of Cam Ward and one of the better receiving corps in the nation, now you have to account for a very physical, explosive back in Damien Martinez. And he proves that if you can't handle the entirety of the Miami offense, he's going to be the knockout punch week in, week out. If there are any games coming up where Cam Ward has a slow start, is not as effective as you would like him to be, or your receiver core is a little bit unsettled, then look for Damien Martinez to really be a breakthrough star down the stretch for Miami. And then Beau Pribula stepping in for an injured Drew Aller after halftime in that game against Wisconsin. Very big win. I was actually at the Penn State campus, had the pleasure of being around an atmosphere that, even though they weren't playing at home, was really, truly electrifying. Nothing can beat a college campus on game day, especially the number 3 team in the nations. And so Beau Pribula in a tough spot, on the road, in a highly integral game before the big one against Ohio State at home. 11 of 13, 98 yards, 1 touchdown, 10.7 fantasy points. A highly effective kind of spot start for him. Not necessarily a real start for him, but still an effective one there. And should he be, the starter, have to replace Drew Aller for this game against Ohio State, look for him to still remain effective. I feel like, I don't want to get ahead of myself talking about this game, but seeing the hype around that campus, expect Beaver Stadium to be very packed that weekend. Expect, no matter what happens in this one, for Penn State to stick with this team. It truly is an incredible atmosphere that Penn State is building, and they are truly a sneaky contender here. They don't necessarily win pretty, but they get the job done, and they do it well. And so I just wanted to acknowledge Beau Pribula, as someone who hasn't necessarily gotten the plaudits he received from a 5-star recruit coming in to Penn State, having to sit behind Aller for at least this year and stepping in as well as he did in that tough situation when they were even down and leading them to this comeback victory. Kudos to him. Kudos to the entire campus of Penn State. That was truly electrifying. If you ever get the chance to go there, go. It's a great atmosphere. But that is my list. Definitely a couple players who, might have been out of the ordinary. Maybe not necessarily players you hear too much about, but that's the beauty of this list. I want to get people more known, get players more known that can help you in your fantasy college football exploits. Without further ado, we're going to take a quick break. On the other side, we're going to begin our positional rankings for Week 9 of the NFL season, talking about some fantasy QBs who could warrant a start for you this coming week. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back to talk about them after this short break.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. We are in our fourth segment of the day here, and as always, we are going to use this segment to start our positional rankings. And looking at the QB position in particular, it's really going to be a week where, anyone can get going, because there are going to be a lot of tough games for certain elite QBs who you might want to pick. And there are going to be some for mid-tier QBs that you might want to take your chances with as well. So I'm going to have you covered with all four of the guys I'm going to talk about, each in their own right. Certain players, whether it be in the tier 1 that you would imagine, or, in the middle tiers, tier 2, tier 3, that really could warrant a start. So without further ado, let us jump right into this ranking this week. So let's start off with a guy who really has been very topsy-turvy this season, as he has been someone who really just, is going to have to be monitored week in, week out for this Atlanta Falcons squad. And the player, of course, who I'm talking about is Kirk Cousins. He's going up against a Cowboys team, though, that is very much reeling. After the bye week, very emotional game against the 49ers, where they felt like they had to prove themselves. And, despite trying to come back in the final moments of the fourth quarter to no avail, I feel like this is a Cowboys team that's going to be down and out. Whereas Kirk Cousins, yes, he had an embarrassing situation against the Seahawks at home where he looked like a shell of what he can be. This week against Tampa looked very impressive. And, I feel like next week as well, he's going to continue to show this momentum that he can ride, should he not get ahead of himself. I think that's the thing with Kirk Cousins. He needs to understand some of his limitations. My father, who personally is a Vikings fan, understands the frustrations people may have with, Kirk Cousins' mobility and questions surrounding that aspect of his game. But I also feel like, the best parts of Kirk Cousins are when, he has the time available to him in the pocket to really pick apart defenses. And in those games, those two games, especially against the Bucs, he really showed that he can still produce at an elite level in both real life and in terms of fantasy perspective. 28.6 fantasy points this week against Tampa Bay, and look for him to continue this production as a Cowboys team that I really can't say many positive things about. As hard as I try to talk in a positive manner about the Dallas Cowboys, they continue to find ways to frustrate me, even though I'm not even a Dallas Cowboys fan. So look for Kirk Cousins to continue to compound the misery for the Dallas Cowboys, especially with the feeling that this deep into the season, he's finally found a rhythm with his skill position players. And it's going to show as the season progresses for this Atlanta Falcons team trying to win the NFC South. And then my second guy who I have here could be seen to still be in that tier 1 of quarterbacks in fantasy, but hasn't necessarily proven it this much this season. However, probably had his best game yesterday against the Bengals of the season, where he looked highly effective rushing the football, throwing the football, and truly proving that he's still got it and could still warrant a fantasy start week in, week out. And that is Jalen Hurts. And obviously, this is more of a matchups one because, of course, he's going against the Jags. And the Jags right now are a dumpster fire. But he proved that, he still could be someone to warrant a start based off of these matches, because not for nothing, the Eagles still have a pretty easy schedule. They haven't faced the meat of their schedule yet, and they still, have room to grow on the offensive side of the football, and we've seen glimpses of it throughout the season. And so, Jalen Hurts, if he can take this performance and translate it week in, week out against teams that he should expect to beat, maybe not until he gets the Commanders will we truly see him face a team that potentially could knock him down a peg again. But 35.1 fantasy points this week against Cincy proves that Jalen Hurts can put up the lofty numbers you might need at the QE position as the fantasy football season progresses and as you're trying to make your playoff push in fantasy as well. He is still a valuable asset, and I'll keep on preaching it for as long as the Eagles look as good as they did on Sunday. But it's really down to Jalen Hurts himself and whether or not he continues to believe in his abilities to lead this team effectively enough. Because if not, then there are ways this Eagles squad can stumble, because there are still some unfamiliarities, with some personnel. There's still some unfamiliarities with the newness of this offensive scheme. But look for this team to still dominate against inferior opposition. Before we get into our third quarterback of the day, who honestly I might want to talk about, we get a comment from Clint. Welcome, Clint, to the show. I believe this is your first ever comment, so welcome. Hope you've enjoyed the show thus far and considering liking, following, and subscribing as well. But you have a comment that I would like to address. Greetings, Week 9 QB question. He's asking about, considering what Winston did to Ravens last week, any way you see Bo Nix repeating his 30 to 40 point fantasy performance against them? I have him and I have Goff. Thanks. Well, I don't necessarily have the Broncos schedule, but I do assume that they're going to be playing the Ravens. Now, both of your quarterbacks, as you say you have Goff, aren't very tough matchups. I'll give them that. But I do feel like this Ravens defense, as Jay Ant enters the chat, welcome to you, my friend. I feel like the thing about the Ravens defense is that it still feels very opportunistic, much like what it was under Mike Macdonald. But unlike Macdonald's defense, you don't have game wreckers. You don't have great communicators anymore in this Ravens defense. Whereas, if you were to start Goff, he's going with the Packers defense that has the communication skills to kind of stymie this Lions offense, but also the corners to, take the football away and generate turnovers. So it's really going to come down to whether or not you feel like Goff is going to be the better option on the better team, or if Bo Nix, is going to have a surprising performance against a defense that might, look weak compared to last year. And considering the fact that Jameis Winston, fresh on his Browns debut, did that to them as well. But at the end of the day, I still feel like Goff would be the safer bet here, because of the fact that, the Lions are a juggernaut, and no matter how Goff plays, look for him to put up touchdowns. Yes, he only had 85 yards in this one, but he still had 3 touchdowns. So he's still going to be someone who's efficient and can get you fantasy production. But it's an interesting point. Hopefully your fantasy football exploits for this week are good ones at that, and I wish you luck in your endeavors. But Andre said, wish me luck. Up by 11, opponent has Najee left. Am I cooked? I'm not necessarily sure you're cooked, but I do feel like Najee Harris has been growing into this Pittsburgh offense, especially with the complementary style that Russell Wilson brings to it. So I feel like, it's going to depend on whether or not the Giants' defense can have a say in this game, really penetrate this very volatile Steelers offensive line. But I do feel like, Najee Harris is always going to be someone who's a wild card and you can't necessarily predict. But I will say you're in a very advantageous spot. Let's get into our third quarterback of the day, and this one kind of makes me look a little bit idiotic because this guy ended up getting a concussion, and we're going to have to see if he even plays next week against the Titans. Drake May. Now, The Patriots did win without him, but let's be real. Even if they lost, Drake May is still the more effective quarterback than Jacoby Brissett. And while this isn't necessarily a quote-unquote stardom situation considering the fact of his injury, it still is a proving point to prove that, yes, the Patriots, even with Drake May's play at quarterback, couldn't win with him. And, Jacoby Brissett immediately comes in and beats the Jets. But it's a proving point as to the fact that Drake May's value is to continue to play. And this concussion was kind of one of those situations where you kind of felt like it was coming because you kind of knew that putting him behind that offensive line with not many weapons at his disposal was kind of like putting a lamb up for slaughter. So this is more of like a wake-up call pick rather than, a true stardom. But I still like what Drake May is doing with this team. And if he doesn't play, then so be it. But it still proves, that yes, you can win with Jacoby Brissett. But Drake May getting these reps and looking as good as he does is highly integral to his success. And they don't want this to turn into, say, an Anthony Richardson situation where he doesn't play and the raw potential that Indianapolis Colts team knows he had looks like it's being wasted. You don't want the same for Drake May. So we wish him a speedy recovery. Hopefully he can play against the Titans, but I wouldn't count on it. So unfortunately, this one kind of looks like a bad pick on my part, but I still think he offers a lot of upside in real life and fantasy. And the final one I want to talk about is Mr. Tua Tagovailoa going up against the Bills. This was my kind of long shot of the week, so to speak. 14.56 points on his return against Arizona. And, it is kind of concerning to see the fact that even with Tua, this Dolphins team can't seem to win, and they are going up against a Bills team that's really riding high, just dominating opponents at every turn. But I feel like there's something to be said about how this team looks with and without Tua. I just feel like the lack of depth at the QB position for the Miami offense really hindered what McDaniel could do with this team. And it showed in this performance against Arizona because Tua looked pretty effective and efficient. But still, at some point, the Dolphins are going to have to give up the ghost a little bit here. But against the Bills, the reason why I picked Tua here is because this is still going to be an interesting game. As Andre said, I got 37 points from Hurts, and somehow I'm still in the losing position thanks to Jaden Reed. Well, that's how the game is played and the sausage is made, my friend. I feel like fantasy, you never know. I feel like Jalen Hurts is someone who is starting to get going. As Andre said, is Reed a touchdown-dependent receiver at this point? I won't necessarily say touchdown-dependent receiver, more as target-dependent receiver. Because let's be real here. No one really knows who the leading receiver for the Green Bay Packers is going to be week in, week out. There are so many different teams in the league that kind of feel like they know that their star players going to dominate every phase of the game, whether it be in targets and touchdowns. But Jaden Reed is one of those guys who, yes, a lot of people still view him as the wide receiver one, but isn't necessarily, in that deep room, going to be seen as someone who's going to get the most targets. This is definitely an offense that loves to distribute the wealth, and fantasy owners of any Green Bay receivers are going to have to take their lumps. And so that's the only thing I can really give you at this point, because I wouldn't say they're touchdown dependent because they don't care where their touchdowns come from as long as they score more than the opposition. But he is someone who is definitely contingent on receiving enough targets to be effective in fantasy. But let's get back to kind of summate this segment here. Tua, I feel like, this is a tough matchup for him, but at the end of the day, he gives the Dolphins the best chance to at least put up a fight in the remaining games. But let me know what you think about this in the comments because, all four of these guys are very interesting quarterbacks in their own right. But to conclude today's show, I'm going to be doing one of my favorite segments, my ever popular segment, my Don't Be Surprised If bold fantasy predictions for Week 9 of the NFL season should be good to close out the day's show. We'll be right back after this short break. Hello everyone and welcome back into our final segment of the day here on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, and it is a fan favorite, one of my favorites to present to you all as well. It is our Don't Be Surprised If segment here on the show. And this one for this week is definitely going to feature a lot of bolder decisions than I'm used to making. I feel like, what with the tenor of the games from yesterday, some of these takes might look a bit more skeptical than you might think, but I still feel like some of them will hit. Now, I feel like, it's going to be highly dependent on how you yourselves play this week out, but I still feel like, some of these takes, while not necessarily winning your fantasy football games, will be important to know for this week. And because they're just my feelings as well, but they could help you make some important fantasy decisions. Without further ado, let us jump right into our final segment of the day. Starting off in the NFC East after a crazy game, this prediction that I just made is one that, feels like it can be a little bit skeptical for this team going forward. And not for nothing, though, it still can warrant consideration from you all if you feel like I'm right in my sentiment to understand the depth of the Washington Commanders running back room. So I'm going to say my first bold fantasy prediction of the week is that the Commanders not letting fantasy points this week by Jaden Daniels, by Austin Eckler. And the reason why I like this is because I'm going to pull up the Commanders schedule here because I am blanking on who they are playing this week. But when I look at the tenor of the Commanders running back room, I really like the balance they've shown. Yes, they play the Giants next week, so that is a very easy matchup for them that I expect them to win. But getting back into why I feel like the Commanders running back room should be getting more of a look. I feel like the balance there to kind of offset, the heroics of what Jaden Daniels can do is really something to behold. Because in that kind of system, your running backs can get caught up, in all the different things involved that your quarterback has to process, that your wide receivers have to get down, and you kind of could get forgotten about. But all three of the running backs, especially, Eckler, understanding that perhaps he might not even be the starting running back. Brian Robinson Jr. doing admirably in that regard. But just giving this team the value that a lot of people, and pundits especially, thought he might have lost in the last couple of seasons for Los Angeles, where he struggled with injury. I feel like he's found his footing and found a proper home for himself in Washington. It's kind of the tone setter for this Washington Commanders offense. Someone who can diversify enough to make this offense less predictable than, say, other college-style offenses we've seen and have shown to have failed. So that's why I feel so confident in promoting Austin Eckler as a valuable fantasy asset this week and beyond for this Washington Commanders offense. And then the second one that I want to get to, this one is a little bit more bold. This one I kind of feel like can hit too as well, but it's going to take a lot for this very hot and cold offense to truly make this prediction ring through. And I said the Cardinals will have 2 players over 15 plus fantasy points this week. McBride and Harrison. Of course, I need to check their schedule as well. But the reason why I say this is because at some point, both of these guys together are going to have a really nice game. If they're facing the Bears, which could prove to be difficult, but I still feel like they can find a way and can really help each other in this matchup. I feel like, McBride and Harrison are 2 players that Arizona can hang their hats on having good games week in, week out. Maybe one of them steps up in place of the other week in, week out, but there's going to be a week where Kyler, Marvin Harrison, and Trey McBride are all going to be in the same page. It's going to be a dangerous week for whichever team they're facing. And this week, yes, it's an unfavorable matchup for them against a Bears secondary that is not going to be defined by that silly Hail Mary play where, one of their corners was taunting the crowd. No, that's not how they're going to be defined. Because it's still an excellent secondary who still has a lot of talent and youthfulness at that position that can really hone in on stopping these guys. The reason why I'm saying this is because of the fact I feel like the Cardinals offense has more opportunity to click down the stretch than any other NFC West offense. And it's a bold take, I know that much. But I feel like we are seeing glimpses of what this truly can look like when this whole operation is up to speed. And what it will look like is going to terrify a lot of teams in the NFL, especially teams who might not be expecting it. They're going to push a lot of teams down the stretch. We're already seeing them pick up nice little wins, comeback wins at that as well, that can really boost their morale throughout the season. And it's going to be highly contingent on players such as this to really separate themselves from the pack in the NFC West. Because as much as I'm still a Seattle Seahawks fan and riding with the Seahawks, I know how deep the NFC West is right now. And I know the dangers of thinking that you could be ahead of the pack when in fact you're falling further and further behind. And so that's why the Cardinals are such a hopeful team, because they are capable of having 2 players who can get you in real life and fantasy 15 plus points. And so that's why this prediction, as bold as it is one that I'm going to say confidently can happen, if not this week, then in a couple weeks down the road. But it's still one that could warrant consideration because of these 2 guys' prowess in fantasy. The third one looks a little bit bad now, but if he does play, I'm telling you, this guy is truly someone who has earned my respect this season for New England. Drake May, again, maybe this is going to have to happen sometime on the road, seeing as to how he most likely is not going to come back from a concussion. We'll continue to talk about and update you on his status throughout the week. But at the end of the day, it isn't far-fetched to see some week someone like Drake May enter the top 5 at a fantasy the QB position for fantasy, rather. But it's going to come down to, whether or not Gerard Mayo truly invests in this season being a season where Drake May can see it out for them as well, or if he wants to protect him a little bit more. I see no reason as to why not, in terms of him immediately coming back from his concussion when healthy. But there is concerns, about the preservation of a young QB, especially with the stories of the past couple of seasons with a guy, like I said, in the previous segment with Anthony Richardson. So I feel like should you know the Drake May train keep rolling this season in New England, he is going to have an opportunity to shock the world and be in the top 5 in one particular week at the QB position. But if not, then, this decision looks a little bit stupid on my part, but also, leaves Drake May's status in the future of this franchise, very much up in the air. So that is one concern here. Because if he's on the field, he looks like a quarterback who's perfectly capable of leading this offense. If not, then it could be detrimental to the fallout of whatever happens down the road for him. But at the end of the day, I truly think he deserves and warrants our respect. And he's earned it, especially for, say, some dynasty players who might be watching now and looking at the future of their teams. Because if you're considering doing a dynasty league or in a dynasty league, Drake May might just be the guy for you. Because of all these rookie QBs, the situation he was put into to perform as he's done over the past couple of weeks is exemplary. And it's proving that this QB market, especially with these guys in this 24 class, is going to be deeper than ever 5 to 10 years down the road because of what these guys are doing now. And that's what makes this storyline so much more intriguing going forward. And it's bigger than just Drake May. It's about the Patriots. It's about this QB draft class. And most importantly, it's about the future of fantasy. So this prediction, I could be wrong. We may not even see Drake May again this season if they decide to, shut him down and are worried about, him getting further injured. But this certainly warrants consideration, considering the fact of his trajectory. The final one that I wanted to present to you guys here today is perhaps my biggest long shot of the week. The Bucs upsetting the Chiefs behind a great performance by Jalen McMillan. Now, this one doesn't necessarily seem as far-fetched as it sounds because of the fact that they did put up a valiant effort against the Atlanta Falcons, but the Chiefs just keep on finding ways to win no matter how horribly they play. And that's the dangers of facing a good team when you're a team like the Bucs, who are going to have to rely upon your secondary weapons, especially a guy like Jalen McMillan. But the reason why I love what Jalen McMillan can bring to this offense is because he's kind of not necessarily a gadget player, but someone who can affect the game in ways other than just his status as a wide receiver. You can use him in the kick return, you can use him on end arounds, you can use him on jet sweeps, you can use him effectively in the red zone. You can utilize him to the best of your abilities and open up even more avenues for this offense, sans Evans and Godwin for the time being. And so, if your offensive attack, while not centered around one particular player, can be diversified because of someone like Jalen McMillan, then that could lead to murmurs of an upset here for Tampa Bay. And I think that it will be calm for Baker Mayfield to rely upon one guy to truly step up for him going forward. And if that guy is Jalen McMillan, then kudos to the Bucs for identifying someone in this year's draft who could be the future of this organization after you say goodbye to Evans and Godwin at whatever time that is. But for the time being, he's going to be the guy who's going to be the X factor for this offense going forward and trying to keep them relevant in the NFC playoff picture. Let me know what you think about this in the comments. I really liked all of my predictions for this week. Let me know what you think. But that will just about do it for today's show. This has been the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. I've been your host, Chris Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in. We'll be back tomorrow, as always, at 3:30 p.m. Eastern. But always remember, consider liking, following, and subscribing to the show. Consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Tickers features here on YouTube to interact with it. But other than that, thank you all for tuning in yet again. I'm out.